You're listening to another ASCI Lounge podcast.
Welcome to the ASCI Lounge. I'm Monique Fenech from Australasian Supply Chain Institute, and this is the Future of Work series. This is a series about the future of supply chain based on a survey that AFGC and ASCI did together with 6 Degrees. Today we have a special guest on the ASCI Lounge to talk to us about the future of work. Venkata Subramanyan, or referred to as Subra, from Head of Planning and Logistics Australia and New Zealand from Kellogg Australia. Welcome, Subra.
Thank you, Monique.
Subra is a supply chain professional with over 35 years of experience, having worked at Kellogg Australia for 23 years and Kellogg India for 2 years. Prior to Kellogg, he worked for 10 years for a paints and chemicals company in India. He's a supply chain committee member at the AFGC and an ASCI member. So really so excited to have you on the ASCI Lounge, Subra. We're so interested in the future of work and the future of supply chain indeed. But let's start at the basics. Let's ask, what does the term supply chain management mean to you?
Thank you, Monique, once again for this opportunity to speak on behalf of supply chain and supply chain management. As people may or may not know, the use of this term is fairly recent in industry circles. And by recent, I mean the last 20 plus years or so. When I started work, which was a while back, but when I started, my first role was that of a distribution executive. And the role involved working with the salespeople to determine the flow of product from multiple manufacturing locations to a host of distribution centers. There were probably about 3 or 4 manufacturing centers and about 30 odd distribution centers to which product had to flow all across the country. And I used to report into a position that was called the materials manager. Now, that's a term that you don't probably see very much nowadays. And I look back at that time and I think I didn't talk supply chain at that time. We were talking procurement, we were talking manufacturing, planning, and materials manager was a term that there which encompassed some pieces of it. And now looking back, I feel that materials manager role, which I reported into, was a precursor to what then evolved into a supply chain manager role. Not exactly the same shape or form, but in a very similar kind of manner. But as I said, the term supply chain is fairly recent, and I wouldn't say it's misunderstood, but at the same time, I would say it's not necessarily a well-defined term in the industry. What I mean by that is that when I speak to people, at one end, some people refer to supply chain management as logistics, like just the logistics operations of day-to-day work. At the other end, there are other people who would say supply chain includes manufacturing, includes procurement in some instances. So anything and everything relating to supply comes under supply chain as defined by those people. If you look at the industry and if you look at where recruiters are nowadays in terms of how they talk about functions, they most commonly refer to the supply functions as procurement, operations, and supply chain. And I think this is probably the most common definition in my mind, where operations largely covers manufacturing, procurement covers the contracting of the goods and services that you need to get into your supply function. And supply chain is essentially managing the chain. And that means the most common definition is where supply chain is supply planning, logistics, customer service, sales and operations planning, and roles like that. That is, in my mind, what supply chain management is all about. And that is exactly the scope of my role in Kellogg Australia. Even though in my own company, I think the word supply chain is used in the much broader context, including operations and procurement. So I'm called Head of Planning and Logistics. But from an industry perspective, I think the role that I do is kind of what is called supply chain. And I think there's a strong need for one common definition in the industry. You go out and talk to people, sales, finance, marketing, they all mean one and the same thing to most people. And, when you say you're working in finance, people exactly know what you're doing. But most times you tell somebody, I'm working in supply chain, they'll say, okay, so what exactly do you do? And then you have to explain yourself. So I think there is a well-established supply chain function now, but they don't necessarily mean the same thing in different functions, in different companies. And to that extent, I think there's a bit of work to be done there.
That's a really common, I think, knowledge within our community, and I think that will resonate really well with everybody. Subra, thanks for that answer. With regards to the study, it was interesting that 69% of our community have a dedicated representative on the executive team. And given that supply chain is increasingly a global marketplace, there's a whole lot of risk and also responsibility for our people. And looking back at your career history as well, Subra, you studied as a mechanical engineer. Do you think supply chain managers deserve the same professional status as engineers when you consider these executive roles and these risk profiles which are global?
Oh, absolutely, Monique. I think supply and supply chain is central to any company, and if you do not have representation on the executive committee, then the company is poorer for that. So to that extent, I think having supply chain on the executive committee is critical, and I think a lot of companies have adopted that now. As you said, 69% probably have. There's a few which still have supply chain sitting under finance or other functions. But predominantly, I think things are moving in that direction. I think, as I said before, going back to the term I used previously, the supply chain being slightly poorly understood in the industry. And even when I kind of qualified, you referred to my initial graduation as a mechanical engineer. I did my post graduation in industrial engineering from a premier institute after that. And that's how I kind of moved into the space. And the unique thing about the course I did was where most MBA courses focused on finance or marketing. The postgraduate course I did in industrial engineering was focused on the management of supply functions. So we did production management, we did materials management, again, the term materials, systems management, and, things like that. So many aspects of that industrial engineering course that I did cover what today we refer to as supply chain management, but it was not called that at that point. There was different terms used. So I think the term supply chain has come to stay now. I think everybody uses it. It's there. It's not going away. And so there is an absolute need for defining the supply chain role, for defining the supply chain skills requirement, having courses at university level or TAFE level or wherever, where people are trained to be supply chain professionals, just as they are trained to be finance professionals or sales professionals or marketing professionals. And that's kind of, I think, slowly coming together. I think ASCI is a good example of something that's calling out the supply chain role more explicitly by having an Australian Supply Chain Institute. And I think we need to really move down the path of nutting down what that means and then making sure that we develop supply chain managers who will be parts of the executive committees of the future.
And it's not just about the supply chain managers, is it? It's also about their teams and taking their teams on this change journey. And from the report, we can see that, the ability to identify the next generation of supply chain talent is strong. But only 51% of respondents rated their ability to identify and nurture that supply chain team as talent. So the robots are coming. We have heard that in the news. So as a supply chain leader, is it yours or HR's responsibility to transition your team into the digital age to be, these highly experienced planning, logistics, and customer service practitioners? Are there enough solutions available, and do you have support from your HR department?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in terms of the question, key part of your question there was, is it yours or HR's responsibility to transition your team? And I think it's absolutely the supply chain leader's role to transition the team to the digital age that is coming. As you said, there are a lot of buzzwords out there. There is a lot that is happening regionally and globally. And I'll come to some parts of that later in any other questions you might have. But as far as this particular query is concerned, I think the challenge at the moment is to really figure out what is the sequence that is going to be, the layout of these new technologies over the next 5 to 10 years. When you talk to people within industry, in universities, and so on, there's a lot of talk about robots and machine learning, artificial intelligence, automation, digital transformation, blockchain, big data, end-to-end visibility. The terminologies are there. All of this talk is there about this is what the future is and this is what is coming. And at this stage, it can get a bit overwhelming. It can get a bit difficult for people to figure out, oh, what does all that mean? And what does that mean for me and my role? And what does that mean for me in 5 years' time and so on? And I think it's the role of the supply chain manager to figure out how much of this is real now, how much of this will be real in 5 years' time, how much of this will be real in 10 years' time, and then work on it in a sequential fashion. So for example, I think blockchain is a terminology that's been used and it's already being used in some, for cryptocurrency, I believe, in banking. It's also been talked about for ocean freight management and so on, but it's still not widely used in supply chain yet. And indications are, even talking to people like Gartner, they think blockchain is probably about 10 years away in terms of really becoming central to supply chain. So we need to figure out what is here and now. And I think if you look at all of the things that I talked about, I think data is definitely becoming more and more a now issue rather than a future issue. End-to-end visibility is the other piece, I would say, where there's a lot of opportunity, where people work in silos or don't really have visibility of what's happening beyond what they are doing. And if you really have visibility from supplier through to customer, there's a lot that can be done much better than what we do today. And potential solutions are available. And most people are still struggling to get their arms around, okay, what does the solution for my company look like? And how much does it cost? And can I afford it now? And can I do it? And so the opportunities are there and they're coming. It's just a question of figuring out what's now and going forward with that. And I don't believe that the industry and unis as such are fully behind in terms of addressing that in a more consistent fashion. Most of the efforts at the moment, everybody's aware of this. It's a bit of disjointed effort. But again, as I can see the light at the end of the tunnel. I can see all this coming together. There could be a unified approach to supply chain, some professional qualification that gets people familiar with these technologies, familiar with what is coming, and a systematic process needs to be put in place. But it's absolutely the role of the supply chain leader to be part of it, working with industry, working with bodies like the Food and Grocery Council, working with you guys in the Supply Chain Institute. We can pull this all together. It's just that at this stage, it's a bit overwhelming, and that's why you might get a bit of a mixed response in service that you do, because a lot of people are working through this, trying to get their head around this particular subject. But I'm sure we'll get there. People are working in the right direction.
So, just to summarize the answer to that question, Subra, because it's so valuable what you're saying. So, you're saying that it's the supply chain leaders' responsibility for the identifying needs within their team. So, in that sense, do you work with HR to brief them on what you foresee in the now and what you foresee in the short term? That will be your resourcing requirements.
Absolutely.
For the team?
I think the roles that we have in the team evolve, and every time we are recruiting for different roles in the function, we have created different roles. Very recently, one of the roles within logistics was turned into an analyst role because we felt that there was a need for that kind of a function. Previous to that, the roles were more operational and managing the day-to-day, but we felt the need for a different role that would bring in analysis into the whole subject. Typically, it's not necessarily just focused on data analysis, but a large part of it is data. So you do work with HR, and as I said, the vision is over the longer term. So the things that you need to do today are just a component of what you need to do over the long term.
Yeah, because when we look at the report, there are losing jobs, jobs that will be redundant in the next 10 years, and winning jobs emerging in the next 10 years. And just as you say, actually, so nice segue there, that supply chain analysts, 71% of respondents say that will be a winning role in the next 10 years. which is fantastic. So so what will become redundant that's going to trouble you and offer some problems in your teams and that sort
I
of thing?
think in terms of the roles, I think the study has identified the roles that would become redundant. I think the ones mentioned are things like drivers and warehouse operatives and so on. And you would notice that most of those roles are fairly repetitive, relatively lower skilled roles, which could be automated, which could be done better by a machine than by people doing repetitive jobs on a day-to-day basis. So yes, the loss of jobs is always a bit regrettable. It's people are affected, but the transition is going to be to new jobs, which are, as we said, supply chain analysts, data managers, automation specialists, and the things like that. And unis and the industry will have to work together to ensure that the right skills are being imparted in the education process. You take the example of drivers. I think, in fact, the problem has, I think, become the other way now, where people are not interested in being drivers, being out of their homes for long periods of time. And there's actually a shortage of drivers already in the industry. The industry struggles to recruit the number of drivers needed for today's roles. But as automation comes through, the need for drivers will come down. Similarly, for movement of stock within a warehouse, you have AGVs, you have ASRS, which is the automated storage and replenishment system that we have. And that has taken away the need for repetitive movement functions within a warehouse. But that doesn't mean jobs are disappearing. That means that there are different jobs that you have to be ready for in the future. And as I said, these are more desk-based jobs, more of IT kind of jobs, if you want to call it that. But IT is really the technology piece of it from an operations perspective. You need people who would be thinking about what needs to be done rather than actually repetitively doing something on a day-to-day basis. So reskilling will be required for existing people in the industry. New skills will be imparted to people who are coming through from an education perspective. And I don't think it's really new. If I go back a couple of decades and think about manufacturing, and when I first went into a manufacturing facility, the number of people in there was enormous. You would see people everywhere. Now I go into a factory and there are very few people around. A lot of the things have already been automated. But that doesn't mean employment has, disappeared. Employment has just gone somewhere else. So manufacturing jobs have come down, but service jobs have come up. So I think something similar will happen in this area. So yeah, loss of jobs in the short term is, not nice. It's something that we need to manage. But people with the right skills will have the jobs of the future.
And I think you make a good point there, Subra, because you do say that our supply chain leaders have been through changes in their teams in the past and have had to transition to, away from manufacturing to this kind of global marketplace. And so I think our supply chain leaders are pretty equipped for this kind of change. But interestingly, from the survey, it says that, and this is a bit of a contradiction, supply chain being a critical enabler of evolution, only half of the respondents agreed that culturally Australian organisations encourage change in their supply chain. So, do you believe the industry is ready to cope with the change? And what are your peers saying
Yeah,
about
again, I
it?
think that response has to be read in context of where things are at this point of time. There are a couple of factors I think that are driving that response. One is, I think, to ask the question: is the industry ready yet? I think people may say, "Oh, there's so much going on. I'm not sure I'm ready yet." But if you look at what is happening within organizations and within the industry as well, there is definitely a lot of effort going on towards understanding what these likely future scenarios are and how do we cope with it. What do we want to start doing now, and what do we plan for next year and the year after, and so on. So there's a lot of discussion going on. People haven't got their heads around it yet. And so to that extent, there might be a feeling that we're not ready, but that doesn't mean the efforts are not going in. And the other factor, I think, which is important in an Australian context, is that we do have the disadvantage of being a relatively small economy by global standards. So in many instances, when we talk about new technology and we talk about things to be done, it can be difficult to achieve the ROI that is required for the implementation of the new technology, for new projects and so on, and justifying spending that money up front. So that that proves to be a bit of a difficult area as well, which might be feeding into the answer to that question again. But if you look at it from what's happening in the developed world, and interestingly, I would say even in the developing world now, look at China and see what's happening with Alibaba and JD.com and so on, and with Amazon in the US. What is happening elsewhere and what is succeeding will ultimately come here sooner rather than later, and it will happen. And I think it's just a question of proving these technologies out. Australians are enthusiastic adopters of new technology, so any new idea that's got legs, I'm sure will get implemented here. And the other opportunity for Australia as a market, I find many times that comes up as well. Those of us who are working in multinational corporations, we could be offering up Australia as the test market or the pilot market for some of these new ideas. So the funding comes more from a global perspective rather than necessarily justifying it in this year's P&L or next year's P&L. But you could be the test market or pilot market for a number of these new initiatives. And then depending on what works and what doesn't work, you have the opportunity to test it out in very controlled conditions in a much smaller market like Australia, and then take it globally from there. So my response is, I think the response to that question is 50-50, because yes, a lot's going on. People haven't figured it out yet, but it is coming, it is happening. People know it is happening. And at some point of time, I think we will see it there on the ground. We will see it happening. So I think there's work to be done, and the answer to that question probably reflects that.
And it's really important to communicate any success in some of those test pilots, because we're in a community where we can share certain non-competitive innovations and different areas where we might be seeing some success and return on investment. So we see our awards as a really important platform for sharing success, and our awards are currently open for nominations, and it's a 2-page submission that we ask of the community to prepare, and the closing date is the 19th of July. So we really do hope that organisations submit, not to just blow their own trumpet, but to share some successes that they've had in particular new areas that they're happy to educate the rest of the supply chain community within. So please, I'm encouraging everybody to do that, because you make a really good point that, we do have some great ideas here. We need to share them in our own community before we take it to the global marketplace. But yeah, really keen to know where people are kicking some great goals. So in summary, Subra, what do you think the future opportunities might be for supply chain here?
I think overall, I would say, just with all the conversation we've had today, I do feel very positive about the supply chain function and its future and the opportunity that it's going to throw up. As you can see, the roles that are coming up are more skilled roles, more technical roles, roles that will require thinking and implementation. And we can see things starting to happen. I think people would have heard about the drone trials that have already been done in Australia. I think there was some commercial delivery of pizzas, and I'm not sure what it was in Canberra. That's already happened. Very recently, I heard from one of our other companies in the Food and Grocery Council about them having appointed a bunch of data analysts into the supply chain function to work on this across the organization. That's the first I've heard of people making a significant investment in that area. And data then gives you insights, and then you use these insights to do what you need to do to improve your supply chain. Digital transformation is very much a common discussion within most FMCG supply chains. I think that is, it to a large extent happened in manufacturing. It's coming into the rest of the supply chain. And the smart supply chain managers will be the one who could work through these maze of developments and determine, as I said before, what are the short, medium, and long-term opportunities, and then orchestrate the implementation in the right sequence. That's where the fun is going to be. Supply chain is an exciting area to work in. As somebody else said in a different context, we are the people who make things happen. So I think supply chain is an area for people who like to make things happen, to come in and see how to do it most efficiently, how to do it most effectively, cost-wise, quality-wise, getting things to the customer at the right time, at the right place. It is the place where it's exciting on a daily basis. So I think, and with more technology coming in, it's really going to make it an even more exciting place. So I would call out to people who are thinking about their future in terms of where they want to be, to look at supply chain as a function that they might really enjoy as a long-term career.
Thank you so much, Subra. I certainly share your sentiments, and I'm sure a lot of people listening in really do as well. I appreciate your time today to join us on the ASCI Lounge, and really think that it's been a great opportunity for our members to seek some clarity around some of these issues that they perhaps were feeling a bit confused about. So thank you so much.
And thank you very much for the opportunity, Monique.
And just before I close, I would like to mention that ASCI's role, as Subra did allude to, is that we are positioning ourselves as a professional accreditation body for the supply chain industry. And in this capacity, we've developed a professional accreditation scheme in line with the criteria set out by the Professional Standards Authority, which oversees, like I mentioned, engineers in Australia and other professionals. So although ASCI hasn't yet obtained this legislation for supply chain as a legislated profession, we're definitely following the exact process in the expectation that one day we'll be ready to seek formal legislation. So join the ASCI community and get on board to really help us with our mission and one day see supply chain management as an official profession. So thank you for joining us on the ASCI Lounge today. This is episode 2 of the Future of Work series. We hope to see you back for episode 3. Bye for now.